maps of Prince George, so I'd really like people to be able to see them. So, I mean, what we could do is actually start out this way and turn them off at that point, I guess.
Wait, you want me to turn it off?
Yeah, sure, that sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, this is running.
Okay, great, thank you. I also want to thank Paul for helping me to organize this. Actually, we've been back and forth since, I think, really late December, maybe, or sometime in December. And also Michelle Connolly, who, as Paul said, is the representative for the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions at UNBC. And I'd like to thank the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, which I'm going to call PICS from now on, just for brevity, because they've been really funding a lot of the research that we're doing here. So just a little bit about our research group, because I think it helps to provide you with some context about the work that we do. I work with a group called the Elements Lab in the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. And broadly speaking, what we do is we work on urban planning and design. A lot of our work is actually applied. In another life, we did some work up here with a group called Smart Growth on the Ground. In the city of Prince George, we've worked with Revelstoke, we've worked with Richmond, so we're usually trying to do applied projects and actually look at what we can think about in terms of planning and design in communities in BC. And one of the concepts I just want to illustrate, because it really will help you understand some of the work we talk about, is this idea about measured visualization. So that's the idea that we're trying to both look at what a place might look like in the future, but importantly for us, we want to know how that place might perform as well. So this example is from the south end of Vancouver. Some of you might recognize it. It's the Marpool area. It's right actually adjacent to the airport in South Vancouver. And what we were doing in this work was looking at whether new development around the SkyTrain line was actually dense enough to support a district energy system. So this is just really an example of the type of work that we do. In terms of some of the context about the work I'm talking about today, as I said earlier, Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, they fund these big 5 projects. So what they did was they said, what are the sectors in British Columbia which have the biggest impact on climate change, on energy and emissions, and they funded these 5-year projects in each of these areas. So natural gas development, Energy 2060 is looking at the energy grid and energy supply. Transportation futures, fairly self-explanatory. Importantly for Prince George, forest carbon management, Werner Kurtz, who's a big name in the Forest Service, actually is leading that project. And then, of course, largest and in the middle is the built environment, because that's the work that we're currently doing. But there are also interconnections between all of these different groups. So one thing I don't think I probably need to tell people up here is that when it comes to research, Vancouver gets most of the attention in the same way that people feel that way about Toronto in Canada more broadly. But one of the things that PICS said to us right off the get-go was it's not just about Vancouver. We need to be thinking about communities across the province of BC. And obviously when it comes to something like climate change, everywhere all communities are emitting, and all communities are going to have to adapt to what climate change means for our futures. So one of the things that we had to do was kind of go back to first principles and think about the fact that Prince George is a very different nail than Vancouver. So when you're thinking about your tools, you're going to need a broader set of tools to actually think about how you might address climate change in these different environments. And just to clarify, when we're talking about our targets, the most common target from the Paris Accord, but also the province of BC's target, is that we need to get to 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 from a 2007 baseline. So it's quite an aggressive target, and we really need a number of different solutions to try to reach that. So putting that in the Prince George context, this is data from the Climate Action Secretariat, which is a part of the provincial ministry, and they do these reports called Community Energy and Emissions Inventories. I'm using the 2010 data here because in more recent versions of this, they actually aren't doing transportation modeling because they don't feel their transportation modeling is accurate enough. And as you can see, on-road transportation makes up the largest share of emissions in our communities. And you see that Prince George is actually fairly close to the provincial average, a little bit higher on-road transportation, a little bit lower on buildings. And one of the things that I like to think that REAPS must be helping with is the fact that their solid waste numbers are actually quite a bit lower than the rest of the province. So, yes, exactly. Wow, congratulations. So that's a really big picture, but as I said, with our group, what we try to do, and I actually might ask for the lights to go down here, thank you. What we like to do is to actually try to say, what does this look like on the ground? We always want to try to spatialize the information and look at what we can say about it on the ground. So some of this information, very obvious from things like the census. I'm sure most of you know approximately the population of Prince George, but what you may not know is the number of buildings. So we actually have a data agreement with BC Assessment, and that's the group that figures out your property taxes. So as you can imagine, they have very good data. And so from that, we have much more information. We have information on every individual house. Actually, we have information on every legal parcel in the entire province right now. But for the city of Prince George, for this mapping, we have the footprint of every house, and we have the BC assessment data associated with that. So one of the things that's really important to us is looking at age. So here I've taken out the commercial and institutional buildings, and I'm just showing you the single-family houses. And one of the things I think you notice, so the oldest houses are essentially white, and then going darker through pinks up to purple. You'll notice that when you look at like the 1950 incorporation area, most of the houses are light or white. And you see this pattern, whereas we move away from the city center, we're getting younger houses. And it's a pretty pronounced pattern of rings essentially going out from the city center. And just a bit of an inset map to give you more of the details. So each of these is an individual footprint of a house. And you see, so an area like this that was all built within the same decade, but then you see another pattern where you have some older houses and sort of almost a salt and pepper thing where new houses have been added over time. Another thing we can get from the BC assessment data is house size. So they give us the number of stories and the floor area of the house, and we can calculate the size. The pattern's a little bit less pronounced here, but I still think that you can see that, generally speaking, the older houses were smaller. And as we've been moving out to the edges of the city, we're getting bigger and bigger houses. And this is something that's often been called the rebound effect, that as our houses have been getting more and more efficient, we've been building bigger and bigger houses. And so when you look at it from an energy perspective, often you get a bit of a wash between the performance of these different areas. So from that data, okay, so another inset map again showing some of the patterns. But from that data, what we're able to do, we can take the age information, and from the age of the building when it was constructed, we can infer what the construction method was. And that tells us something about the energy performance. What insulation was in the walls, what type of windows were used, what type of heating equipment was used. And then we can take that and through simulations tie it to the house's age, and we can get information then about what we think is the energy performance. So this map then shows what we think is the energy performance of the single family housing stock in Prince George, going from green, which is low, all the way up to the very dark colors, which are high. And again, not as nice a pattern as you got with age, but you do start to see that certain neighborhoods, which are probably built somewhere in the 80s, but also have big houses, would tend to perform worse on energy. So that's single family houses. I kept it to single families because the patterns are more recognizable, but we also did it for all of the institutional and commercial buildings in the area too. And so for us, what this means is we now have essentially a baseline of energy in the city of Prince George. Our interest is always not about how accurately can we represent what's actually there. We're really always focused on what are the strategies and solutions that we can look at, that we can apply to a place like Prince George to try to actually reduce energy use and reduce emissions. So as I say, what are our options in buildings and in our communities to try to address issues of climate change? This is really sort of a framework that we use to think about it. It's done by some researchers, Ratty, Baker, and Steamers, MIT and other places, but it's just a really useful way of thinking about it. So along the top in the boxes, we have different aspects of what we consider to be the built environment. Urban pattern represented here, what you might think of as the street patterns and the buildings of the city as a whole. Building design and materials, so that would be things like what's your building constructed out of, what is the insulation value of the walls, of the windows. Building systems is things like your heating system or your cooling system. And then user behavior, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. And then finally at the end, emissions. And what's really useful about this is they actually did work to try to figure out what's the difference in performance between the very worst example of this and the very best example of this. So for example, when you're talking about urban pattern, you might say a really low density single family neighborhood could be the worst performing, and a higher density multifamily with mixed uses and commercial might be the best performing. And so there's a factor of 2 difference between, as they say, the very worst and the very best. Similar for your design and materials, again similar for building systems. User behavior is a big factor. Energy modelers often say that a building performs up to your expectations until people get into it, and then everything changes. And then finally, the really big one here, particularly when you're talking about emissions, is the fuel source. If you're talking about coal versus hydroelectric power, there could be a factor of 10 difference between the performance of your systems. So you can think of this as nested scales, that people use systems in buildings. Buildings exist within blocks, and blocks exist within a broader urban pattern. And so there are all of these interconnections that happen between it. Another thing which I think is important in this context is that generally speaking, the influence of an individual citizen is going to increase going the other way. It's much easier for you, we'll talk about that a little bit later, it's theoretically much easier for you to change your behavior than it is for you to have an impact on the way the city is planning their environments necessarily. So what I'm going to do is just step through pieces of this, different solutions that may be applicable in Prince George for trying to reduce energy emissions. The first one, this is the area that we work in the most. I'm actually going to not talk about it in great detail here, but is this idea of compact complete communities. So many of you may have heard of things like smart growth or new urbanism. Portland has something called 20-minute neighborhoods, which is all about how accessible everything is. Can people walk and bike to different conveniences in their neighborhoods? And what again, this is a really urban pattern. I also just want to tie in the fact that we aren't dealing with mobility, but urban pattern has a huge impact on mobility as well, how people can actually move around the community. So unfortunately, we have a question mark for its factor, but we know that it's at least as big and likely much bigger than the built environment. This is what I was trying to get to show you. So this is something a colleague of mine did a number of years ago, and it's in some ways it's sort of over the top, but it's quite illustrative of what a compact complete community might look like. So this is a picture from Burnaby, right near Metrotown in Burnaby. And it's a picture of, a car-dominated culture or car-dominated environment. And through photo manipulation, what he's done is represented what a compact complete community might look like. And just breaking that down into some of the different pieces, these are other renderings. This is actually the Dockside Green neighborhood in Victoria. But what are the pieces that make up a compact complete community? So first of all, there is a necessity for density. You need to have a certain amount of people in a smaller area to facilitate things like services. So it's much easier to have grocery stores and restaurants and cafes if there's a lot of people that live in an area and can access it. Things like public transit has requirements for a certain amount of density to be able to facilitate it. And then finally, things like biking and walking and the ability to actually move around in those environments is greatly facilitated by it. And then something that's not part of the energy picture necessarily, but I think would resonate with Reeves, is this idea of the public realm and the idea of urban ecosystems. So you may not have your own individual yard, but if you concentrate people in a smaller area, you can have more green space, and you can start looking at things like ecological treatment of wastewater, which is something that's taking place in a number of different areas. So what does this actually mean for Prince George? As I said to Paul before I came here, I don't want to act like I'm picking on Prince George, because this is true in pretty much every community in North America, that we've grown over time, really since the car was dominant. As a result, people have been moving out of our city centers and living in areas outside because they can easily get into the city center using their automobile. So what compact complete communities would actually mean for a place like Prince George is that people have to move back in. And this may not mean that everybody moves into the city center, but generally speaking, the idea is that you design around a certain number of nodes where there are services and that people live around those nodes. What citizens can do about this is obviously participation in the planning process. I'm actually not sure where Prince George is right now in terms of their official community plan, whether there's any work going on it or whether it's accepted right now, so I don't know whether there's opportunities for that. But one of the things I was saying to Paul at lunch is this is very much a choice. I mean, I recognize that people move to a place like Prince George, maybe from a big city like Vancouver, because they want to have their own single-family house and live outside of the city center. And so there are choices to be made there, and those choices obviously have energy and emissions implications, but I think that's one of the kinds of things that being involved in the planning process, that the community itself can actually decide how they want to do these types of things. So the next one I want to talk about is what I consider to be, in some ways, the big win right now. This is the area that's actually moving very well, and that's new construction, building standards, and specifically I'm going to talk about the EVC Step Code. So when we're talking about new construction, we're talking both about the design and materials for new buildings, but we're also talking about the building systems. How are we heating our homes? How are we cooling our homes? And as I said, this is a real success story, I think. We're quite far along in it. There's literally dozens of new standards that are growing up everywhere. Some of the most common ones are LEED, Passive House, maybe some of you have heard of, but there are many more, and they're coming all the time. And the good thing about it is that the construction industry has really been adopting this. I think this is an area where I have some of the least concern about what we're doing going forward. But what I want to really illustrate and point out is of December of last year, the province has implemented their Step Code. And one of the nice things about this is that it simplifies. We don't have to worry about all the different building standards out there. We can focus just on this one. And there are two things about it that I think are really interesting. First of all, it's a performance-based code, so rather than telling you you have to build your house like this, which is what the BC Building Code currently does, it says your house has to perform to this standard, and how you do it is to a certain extent up to you. So you can explore different designs, different approaches. So the first step is just meeting the current BC Building Code, which is applied throughout the province right now, but you have to actually prove that you're performing that well, which currently people don't have to do. And then you run through a series of steps. I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but getting all the way up to step 5, which means that you've created a house that performs so well that with the right kind of energy fuel source, it actually could be net zero. It could have no net emissions. And the second piece about this that I think is really interesting is currently with the BC Building Code, Vancouver is the only city in the whole province that has its own building code, who can actually require stricter requirements than the BC Building Code. And as a result, Vancouver's building standards are actually higher than Prince George's, even though it has a very temperate climate. So with the Step Code, every municipality in BC can actually regulate themselves what step people have to construct new buildings to. And so similar to planning, I think particularly a group like REAPS, who clearly I would say are active in these things, could actually try to influence council and city planners to try to adopt higher steps. Right now, across the province, it's primarily about single-family houses. Commercial buildings are only part of the Step Code for the Lower Mainland. I think that those are going to roll on stream over the next number of years. And the idea is by 2032, to be moving up that ladder so that we're looking at producing all of our new buildings to net zero ready levels. So as I said, I think new construction is the real success story. The one where I think we have significant untapped potential is the idea of retrofitting existing buildings. So similarly, this applies to building design and materials and building systems. But the really important thing I think to know about retrofits is our building stock tends to turn over at about 1 to 1.5% a year in North America. So if you extrapolate that out to 2050, about 52% to 68% of our buildings are still going to be here. And in Prince George, that's somewhere around 14,000 to 19,000 buildings that are built now that will still be here in 2050. So there's a large potential to achieve energy savings through energy retrofits, but there's also some significant challenges. Just in terms of the images, the top image is a thermal imaging study that was just run in the city of Vancouver, where they went around and did thermal imaging on a number of neighborhoods. And basically what that tells you is, where is heat leaking out of your house? Why is your house performing badly? And that tells you something about where you might want to focus your efforts to improve the way it performs. And when we're talking about retrofits, we're talking about things like adding insulation to walls, changing out your heating system. More now, we're talking about things like air source heat pumps, which are running on electricity. And when you look at that in the Prince George context, one of the things that's really interesting here, actually a colleague of mine is working with Guido Wimmers from the UNBC, and they have been looking at what you all know as the Prince George Special, that special type of house that was built in 1965 to 1975. And it is, generally speaking, in those older housing types where you can get the biggest bang for your buck. So if you have $10,000 to spend, you can bring one of those houses maybe up to performance of a 1990 level house, but that's a big gain, whereas modern houses are much more difficult and much more expensive to retrofit. So what I've done here is just isolated all of the houses in Prince George, which were built between 1965 and 1975, which gives you a bit of a picture of the kind of housing stock that you're talking about if you could actually retrofit. The biggest problem here, and part of the reason I don't have what citizens can do here, is a lot of the incentive programs, there was one called Live Smart, which was a provincial incentive program, are not in existence right now. And we've been talking to the provincial government, also to different municipalities. This is very much on everyone's radar. We all recognize that if we're actually going to try to reach our targets, that energy retrofits are going to be a big part of the picture. And so my guess is over the next, say, 2 to 3 years, there's going to be a lot of movement on this, and there will be, hopefully, more programs which are supposed to help with this. And again, as I was talking with Paul about before we came here, another part of the problem with this is, do we have the trades to actually go in and do a lot of this work? If we do start having incentives and people want to retrofit, do we have the right people to actually go and do this work? So this is to me, a real question mark right now. An area which I think probably resonates with REAPS, with a lot of the work you do, is the issue of behavior change. And my byline for it is that it is simple in concept, but it's actually quite difficult in practice. So as I said, it's got a factor of 2.6, so of the middle set, it's got the largest potential, but it's actually quite difficult to change people's energy behavior. This is a book that I will always recommend to people. It's not the easiest read necessarily, but it's really interesting, and I found it profound, and a lot of people that I know and work with feel the same. It's by Elizabeth Shove, called Comfort, Cleanliness, and Convenience. We know from psychological research dating back to the oil crisis in the 1970s that it's very difficult to get people to change their behavior with information. Providing people with information and getting them to change the way they behave rarely works, and there have been hundreds of studies, maybe thousands of studies on this. And so what Elizabeth Shove said was the problem is that people make their choices based on other concerns. Things like comfort, cleanliness, and convenience. So you need to pick up groceries, you need to drive to the store. In North America, we tend to shower every day. These are the kinds of things that are essentially norms for how we do things, which greatly impact our overall energy use. And I knew coming to this audience that there would be one big counterexample that people would say, but yeah, but what about recycling, which we've shown works? And there's been a huge amount of research on this. And what it tends to come down to is the idea, again, of social norms. Your recycling bin is out at the end of your driveway, and so are your trash bags, and all of your neighbors get to see it. And as a result, people are concerned about being judged for the way they recycle. So this is a real advantage of the recycling program, and there have been attempts to try to do the same thing with energy, things like energy competitions between buildings or between neighborhoods. Also things that are coming online now, like energy labeling. So when you sell your house, part of the sale would actually be a report about how it performs for energy. But a large part of the problem is that energy tends to be invisible. With the exception of maybe when your neighbor puts on their big Christmas light display, you really don't get to see your neighbors and how much energy they're using. So that's a big, I think, difference between recycling and energy in this area. So this is one of my own just sort of pet theories, which is that we should be using design to make pro-environmental decisions easier. And the example I often use, it's maybe a bit trite, but it is the issue of the Tesla, which I just saw a recent report that said the #1 selling luxury vehicle in China is the Tesla over BMW and Mercedes. And a large part of that is because they paid so much attention at the beginning to the design. It doesn't look like a smart car or a Prius, it looks like a luxury vehicle, and as a result, it's something that people want. A more appropriate example might be something like an LED light bulb. It's more expensive up front, but it has a long life and it's very easy for people to do it. And so you might save 2 to 3% of your home's energy bill by switching out your lighting. And finally, the last category I want to talk about is the issue of renewable energy. So, first we want to get our house in order and make our buildings more efficient, but then there's the real issue of how do we actually supply energy to our buildings. And as I said, it has easily the largest impact on emissions. So in BC, just to give a picture of energy in BC, about 52% is oil. That's largely from transportation. Natural gas has industrial uses, but also for heating our homes. Electricity is a big contributor. And then when you look at direct energy, coal only produces about 1%, which would be, again, sort of industrial uses of energy. And the big thing that people talk about when they talk about what we want to do about our energy sources in BC is moving off of the high emissions fuels to electricity. And then another piece, and this is really, I think, resonant for Prince George specifically, is the idea of biomass and biofuels. You have big feedstocks here. You actually have one of only a handful of district energy systems that's running. I can't figure it out necessarily from the website, but it's either running entirely on biomass with a natural gas backup, or it's some mix of those fuel sources. And it's one of very few in North America that actually is running on biomass. So in terms of hydroelectricity, this is one of our real structural benefits in BC. We have huge amounts of clean, inexpensive electricity because of hydro. In fact, we're the second lowest electricity costs in North America, only behind Quebec, who also have huge hydro reserves. By some estimates, and this is from an economist that we work with, he thinks that if we actually want to hit our emissions targets, we're probably going to need about 2 times as much electricity in 2050 as we're currently using now. Now, some of our hydro is actually being shipped to the States and to Alberta at times, so we have some excess capacity potentially there at certain times of the day. But it's why things like Site C Dam, which I think probably a lot of you have heard of up here, become an issue, because then it becomes an issue of local ecological damage versus what is the impact from a climate change perspective of emissions, and how do we actually try to balance those different interests. In terms of what citizens can do, this is where our structural benefit of hydro is actually a structural deficit in some ways in terms of other renewable energy sources. I work with a number of people that do some of the cost determinants on solar and solar thermal, and even though solar has been coming down dramatically, it's still not economical to do it. You have very long payback periods on solar, and it's because our hydro is so cheap. So really the reason to do something like solar would be the ethical choice, or for resilience and energy security. If you want to have that choice yourself, you can avoid blackouts by having battery backups, but also you just introduce another energy source to your community. And then the thing I really want to highlight, because I do think it's a feature of Prince George which is quite unique, and I think would be interesting to see where it goes in the future, is the district energy system. So currently it's attached mostly to commercial and institutional buildings. If you wanted to expand it, the problem with district energy usually is that you have to have a certain amount of heat demand to make it economical. So if you wanted to expand it, you might actually have to think about building some multifamily units in the downtown area and hooking those up to the district energy system to try to expand that system. So I wanted to just end off by illustrating the whole picture with some of the research that we're doing. This is research that's currently ongoing. I wish I could tell you the answer is B, but we're not there yet. We have another 3 years of research to go on this. But what we're trying to do is investigate a combination of these future strategies. So going back to that same framework, what we're trying to do is take pieces of all of them and generate scenarios where we look at different bundles of solutions against different patterns of urban form. So the other piece that's really important here is that local context. What is the urban pattern that we're trying to replicate and that we're trying to find solutions for? What are the weather conditions, which is a big thing, obviously, from a standpoint of energy emissions. So what we've done, and this is shortening up our research quite a bit, but what we've done is we've created a set of these urban form patches, 400 meter by 400 meter patches. There's 7 of them, and we did it from census analysis, looking at a number of different communities. But the idea is that you can take these patches, you can replicate urban form that you see in a place like Prince George, and by combining them, you could actually create a version of Prince George, essentially, and then you can run energy simulations against them. So this is, very common single-family neighborhood with what we call a loops and lollipops road style, but it's essentially cul-de-sacs. And you can see, if you look at the map closely, that there are a number of areas in Prince George that are very much like this community. And so what we can then do is we take energy models and we can model the energy demand of each individual building, but the simulation tool we're using actually also models the effects between buildings. So if you have shading between buildings, which might affect how much heat you're getting from solar insulation, this can pick that up. And you look at the pie chart in the lower right, you can see what are the different end uses in a house. So heating, of course, is the biggest one. And then you can see how different types of house types from different vintages actually perform. And if we actually unpack that a bit, we see that the 2 worst performing houses are a 1975 house, and I'm actually 99% sure that that's our Prince George special house that we're using as our archetype for that housing type from 1975. And then the other one is the newest house from 2011, and the reasons are completely flipped in some ways. The efficiency of the 1975 house is really poor, but it's small. And the efficiency of the new house is about twice as good, but it's also over twice as big. So this is that rebound effect that we've been talking about. So what we can do then is we can run future scenarios against that. We can say, okay, let's play this out to 2050. We'll replace 1% of the houses in the neighborhood, and we'll retrofit 2% of the houses in the neighborhood. Let's see what kind of energy performance we get by doing that. So again, this is the baseline. When we run this retrofit replace, we only see an 8% reduction in total energy use. And again, if we try to unpack what's going on there, so we replaced some houses at a very high standard. Passive house has a very high standard, and this means energy use intensity. So that means how much energy you're using per unit of area in your house. And you can see that it performs very well on that number. But because we built so many new houses to the current BC building code with current standards, these big houses that we tend to be building now, it really washes out any of the energy gains that we would get in that circumstance. Some municipalities in the Lower Mainland are starting to talk about house size restrictions, but I think you can imagine that that's a pretty contentious issue, and I'm not sure how soon we would expect to get there. But this is, as I say, one scenario run against this type of neighborhood. Our work, what we're doing right now, actually is running a number of different scenarios, a number of different strategies to see what works best for a single-family neighborhood, what works best in a commercial neighborhood under different conditions. And I would also say that we have 6 communities: Prince George, Kelowna, Saanich, Vancouver, Surrey, Revelstoke. And we have weather files for each of those. We can run this in Prince George versus in Kelowna and see the different performance that you might see in those different environments. So just trying to summarize all of that, I tried to take a fairly high pass at a lot of it. But the first thing is we need to think about reducing our energy use. And that comes down to things like compact complete communities, new construction standards, retrofits, and trying to change people's individual energy use behavior. If we can get those numbers low enough, then we could come in with low carbon or zero emissions supply, like electricity or biomass, and we could start to get towards reaching that 80% reduction by 2050. And so the question which we're really trying to answer right now, and as I say, I wish I had more answers for you, but this is the work we're doing right now, is trying to figure out what are those combinations of strategies. And then finally, just going back to the title, I think it's important to think about the fact that we cannot predict the future. We use models and scenarios as tools to think about it. So we might run 10 scenarios on a single-family neighborhood in Prince George, and we might be able to sort of surround the truth, but we never get to the truth of what's actually going to happen. And to illustrate that, I just want to raise some of the things that we actually know are coming. Things like autonomous electric vehicles. If you think the car changed dramatically the way we plan our neighborhoods, I think autonomous vehicles are going to do something similar, and we don't yet know what that's going to look like. And then more generally, things like artificial intelligence and automation, things like guaranteed income, which are being pushed to counter the effects of automation. We know these things are coming, and we know they're going to have huge impacts. The really difficult thing is that there are clearly going to be a set of disruptive technologies that we're not seeing that are coming that are going to have big impacts, and we just have no way of knowing that. So the example I would draw there would be Uber. 10 years ago, nobody would have thought about that, and it's not so much in Canada necessarily, but in the States, it's having dramatic impacts on the way mobility happens in cities in the States. So I'm just going to leave it there. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
So we got lots of time for questions, so please take advantage of this opportunity.
So can you go back to the slide where you show the flow chart with the different scaling factors?
Sure.
Sure, this is fine.
Yeah.
So what is it that you're measuring here? Is it energy input from like kilojoules or something? Is it carbon emissions, efficiency?
It's energy demand. And this, I mean, you can understand that this would be something that was relatively crudely quantified. But for these factors, it's all energy demand. And this has been done quantitatively. It's actually research that was done a lot in Europe, where they actually did do simulations and generate factors related to it. But it's a thumb situation. It's not deadly accurate. And then the emissions one is a separate factor. And that's, yeah. So that, I know it's maybe a little bit confusing, but the first set are for demand, and the last one itself is specifically about emissions of fuel sources. Yeah.
What work has been done with regard to using time of day costing for hydro? I know it's a politically contentious issue, but it really works in Europe.
The challenge with hydro, and we've done a lot of work with hydro, there are great people there, but they're pretty closed mouth about what's going on. So I actually can't tell you. I mean, it certainly is an issue that's been brought up, but I don't know what they're doing about it. For example, another example of that with hydro is we can get information on residential buildings, commercial buildings. We can't get anything on industrial buildings, and without knowing what they're using, it becomes really difficult. And you start talking about time of day costing. Well, what you would be trying to do often would be balancing industrial uses and residential uses if we don't have the information. So I wish I had a better answer, but that's part of the problem.
We've known for years how to make cars more fuel efficient. Like, we should be getting 3 or 4 times better than we are. Look at the amount of oil we just saved. Why isn't anything being done about that? North America's making cars for Europe, and Europe gets better mileage than we do.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I was talking to David, who's done his work on internal combustion engines, so he probably knows this better than me. I think we are moving on that. The question to me is, are we going to get there before it gets surpassed by electric vehicles?
Politics.
Yeah. I really think that because the technology companies have adopted the idea of electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, that the amount of effort they put into, they're going to pass the internal combustion engine. I don't know that we will get to a point of very efficient internal combustion engines before we just move on to a new technology. And David, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that from your PhD research. I don't want to put you on that.
Well, I think having lived in Germany for a couple of years, one of the most striking differences is, again, talking about population density. We're talking about cities that have existed for hundreds, if not even 1,000 years. And so they're a lot more compact, and so they lend itself much better to the kind of urbanization and mass transit and that kind of thing, even though we have some very, very old buildings that are in these cities. But the other striking difference is that we're paying $1.10 or $1.20 for a liter of gasoline, whereas in Europe, you know, they're averaging about 220 to 250 a liter. And I mean, that alone makes a big impact on the pocketbook, and that drives the decision what kind of car you buy.
James, I think you
I don't know if it's really a question, but more of an observation. So, you know, electric is being touted as a very positive thing, but I don't see a lot of discussion about electrical sources. So, for example, if you're driving an electric car in BC, it's actually pretty good because you've got hydro use power, but if you're in Alberta, you're burning coal to drive your car. And if you're in Ontario, you're basically supporting nuclear.
Right.
Is there anything out there in consideration, just, you know, how we're going to level the playing field in terms of electric here versus electric there? Because it is apparently quite different.
Yeah, so a couple things I would say about this. I have seen the research that would say it's still better to be running electric vehicles, even if you're talking about natural gas or even coal-fed power plants, because you're centralizing the emissions rather than having them distributed. Be that as it may, the Energy 2060 project that I referenced, that's a lot of the work they're doing. Their work, it's funny because PICS is a group that funds work in BC. A lot of their work, I'd say almost most of their work, is actually in Alberta. So what they're really interested in is the grid transfers between the provinces and how that actually all balances out. I don't have a good answer for you in terms of what we're going to do because we have so little influence over Alberta and the way they generate their electricity. But I still think from what I understand, it's still better to be running electric vehicles.
And these compact, complete communities look lovely.
Right.
Are there some good examples of them? And then what are you finding is actually bringing people into town? And I'm asking this question a little guiltily because you know, I have my lovely 2 acres on the outside of Prince George, and I'm thinking, what would it take to bring me into the center of Prince George? And of course, air quality is a huge factor here in town. But the first question is, do you have some good examples, and is it working? And
so the one I referenced, one way that people refer to this is 20-minute neighborhoods, and that comes out of Portland in Oregon, which is always held up as an example of this. So what they did, and there's some really interesting maps online that show these sort of heat maps, but they tried to plan their entire downtown so that all of these neighborhoods have these 20-minute circles so that you can walk or bike and get to all of the different services. Now, of course, what's different about that is that Portland is a bigger city. There's also examples of it in Vancouver, so the new Olympic area is actually relatively dense, but another one which they just announced last week is they're planning to put, I believe they said, 50,000 more people along the Cambie corridor, which is where the new SkyTrain route went, and they've been doing that work. Actually, some work in the lab before I got there looked at that. So there are examples of it, but it really is an issue of it's happening in bigger cities, and it's why I always try to add that caveat. You know, you don't want to come in here like you're scolding Prince George, because nobody in these smaller communities tends to be doing it. We just actually put in a proposal, which I think is actually a better way to do this, which is we want to actually now start tying what we consider to be livability to urban form, so that we can actually measure things that coincide with livability, like walkability, like air quality, access to services. And the idea being that if you can tie livability to urban form and energy and emissions to urban form, then you could plan for livability, the kinds of places that people want to live, and your outcome is actually energy and emissions, better performing. That's the idea behind it. But I mean, that's, to me, the big problem is there's a reason why people move to less dense centers, because they want to live outside of town. And so how do you incentivize people to do that? I also think some of the stuff on autonomous vehicles is very interesting, because you can conceive of a world where we could live similar to the way we're living now, but have electric autonomous vehicles that park themselves, and we don't need parking infrastructure, and people can still live outside of town. This is what I mean about the scenarios piece. We really need to ask these what-if questions about what future environments might look like.
So Prince George, the planners seem to think that residents want destination parks.
Right.
Because when your Prince George specials were built, there was all these little green spaces with playgrounds in all the neighborhoods.
Right.
The city let them go run down. we're going the wrong way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not my area of expertise. I actually work with somebody from landscape architecture who does green space, and that's really her area. But I mean, the idea of it is that you increase density and as a result have more green space. But if you're not caring for that green space, that's clearly an issue. I don't have a good answer
Well, just your argument for your 20-minute
Yeah,
neighborhood
right.
is an argument for rejuvenating.
Yeah,
outlets
absolutely.
and not putting in another destination park.
Right. Yeah, no, I would agree with you there, and as I say, I've worked closely enough with somebody who's an expert on that that I don't feel qualified to talk about it. Yeah. I don't want to get him back to her that I tried to answer something about pocket parks and local green space.
John, you showed a slide earlier where you have the different edges of the city kind of agglomerating toward the city center, and there's a lot of resistance to that for a number of reasons.
Yeah, absolutely.
But within Prince George's, there are many cities, there are these little communities, and here we have what's called the Heart, we have the College Heights area, and instead of having trying to encourage people necessarily to agglomerate into this downtown core,
Right.
You talk about this 20
neighborhoods is
that you would have these cores that may be centered around the Heart, College Heights. But I guess when we talk about that, it all sounds really good on one hand, but then another issue creeps up, and that is the idea of urban sprawl, because now you'll have College Heights being one kind of area that's there, that they have their little sub-community, and then you have the Heart being another sub-community, and so that community unity, I guess, is kind of lost. So there's always that balance between 20-minute communities and sprawl that needs to be balanced. And as a community and as the city planners kind of figure out where is that appropriate balance for that.
Yeah, I didn't show it on the graphic. I think I said it in words. I meant to say it in words about the idea of having nodes, multiple communities that may be a collection of these things. But another problem for Prince George, which is a problem for a lot of communities, is I believe, I didn't look at the most recent census data, but from 2006 to 2012 in the census, you had a growth rate of about 1.8%.
Was that much?
Yeah, it was during that period. It was actually negative in Revelstoke, and I think, as a resource community, I think that's probably quite cyclical, right? Between any two census periods, you might have, no?
No, it's just been downhill.
Been contracting, but so that becomes part of the problem. I mean, as we were walking in, Paul pointed out what was supposed to be a condo development next door, which has turned into a hotel, and that sort of references some of that, right? Is the idea if you want to try to build more capacity in the downtown, and then it sits empty and finally converts to a hotel because the developer doesn't complete the development. So yeah, I mean, those are structural issues that a place like Prince George has, and again, it's why I always try to say these are concepts, these are ideas, but I'm not suggesting that this is going to
Just
be
one little
the solution.
correction on that. I believe the original plan for that site was a hotel with luxury condos above.
Oh, okay, so it was like a mixed use.
And the luxury condos
Yeah.
were dropped, and then the place sat idle for many years until another hotel chain decided to develop.
Okay, yeah. Yes.
We've built how many in the last 5 years?
I can tell you, I came here once and there was a cattlemen's convention on, and I drove around till 4:30 in the morning. I couldn't find a place to stay. So according to me, you need more hotels in Prince George.
That happens once in a blue moon.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's true.
I'm curious why you didn't have the Heart in your maps of Prince George.
You see a little.
Well, it was there in outline, but in terms of my knowledge, I'm sure I.
No, I couldn't even see it on the maps.
Oh, I could.
Well, yeah, up to the weigh scales is what.
Yeah, the weigh scales, but it didn't include the whole Heart Highway.
How far back I have? Oh, it's right there.
You're looking for your house, that's
not a
why.
good one.
Oh, they were all like that.
Yeah, it kind of cuts off the rest of the chapter.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Well, northern tip.
You know what the problem is?
I can't get it all on there.
Well, this is what I said to Paul on the way back from the airport. I said, the problem with Prince George is it's too tall. Because our slides, of course, are running, horizontally landscape, and I couldn't fit it all in. And my concern was that if I showed everything that was there, which we do have all of that data, that there's not, you can't actually see the patterns that are evolving.
If I lived way up the Hart Highway, I would be hurt.
I'm sure I will. Think of my concern when I was doing the inset map, and thinking that I was probably showing somebody's house who was in the room, right? So,
But when
yeah.
you think of the Hart and College Heights areas, and you look at the facilities that they have their shopping centres.
Right.
They have their restaurants.
Yeah.
I think the only place in which it doesn't is maybe in Pineview area, which is very rural.
Right.
But these satellite areas do have that infrastructure.
Right.
And they have the high schools and the elementary schools.
Are they walkable, or do people still drive to the
They're
supermarket?
They're pretty walkable,
Are they?
especially the
Yeah.
Hart. I lived up there for many years and we used to walk.
Your top left arrow, I used to live by it, and I'd walk to one of the other arrows. I'd walk back and forth. It was now walkable.
You're a dedicated walker, I think.
But it's the feeling, it's the habit, like you can't
On a different note, a lot of what we do as individuals is perhaps driven all by marketing. And I see that as a huge issue, not just in BC, but everywhere, because we are sold products that are going to die in 5 years or 10 years, but it's not necessary. They could be building very efficient things that we use in our homes. But not only that, but is there any sense that anybody is out there trying to encourage people that small is maybe better than big? Because we are in this build big, you need all this space, and it is insane.
Right, and you know, I mean, that, of this talk, I mean, when we get into things like new construction and retrofits, that's areas that we're looking at, but the thing that actually our group does is what you're talking about, which is more about the urban planning and design. And, you know, as I say, we try to actually always go and show that idea about what are the benefits that you get by the compact complete communities. You can do things like district energy systems, you can afford to have transit because there's enough density to support it, but you're pushing against all of the market, as you say, all of the marketing that's been pushed for so long, and all of our communities which have been planned since the automobile. It is really difficult. We work with some economists, some behavioral economists, and you know, they try to push some of that type of work, but it really is pushing uphill, unfortunately.
That's a great question, Linda, because it got me thinking that a lot of the so-called consumer choices that we make are really so heavily constrained by the options that are out there. So, for example, when I moved to this community, I wanted to be within walking distance of my former place of employment in the downtown area. So it was about, say, 2 kilometer radius. I also wanted to have a yard where I could garden. So that meant I had to have a single family dwelling for a one-person household, which is completely crazy from an energy point of view. But there was no semi-detached or at least in a non-dodgy neighborhood, or townhouse type of development available where I could get what I was looking for. And so my apparent choice was really heavily constrained. And I think a lot of the choices that people make are very heavily constrained by what's out there. And it's maybe more extreme in a small community because you just have a smaller menu to work from.
Yeah, one of the interesting things to me, which is an example of this, or a counterexample to this, so UBC at this point in time is over 60,000 people. It's essentially a city at this point, and I don't know if most of you know, but there's a lot of private development that's been going on there. The interesting thing about it is UBC is the landowner, they're the developer, and they're the planning department and the managers of all of the buildings. So you have this, it's sort of like Apple's argument all the time, when you build the whole widget, you can do things differently, right? It enables that. And so there's a neighborhood in the South Campus where they're doing these, you know, really interesting mixed developments where you have low-rise multifamily, but you also have attached buildings, right, like duplexes and row houses and whatnot. And then the other really interesting piece is that there's a retirement home there as well. And so you get this interesting intergenerational play and aging in place and all of those kinds of things. So there are examples of things that work well where you have these choices, but unfortunately, those are places where you almost take the market out of the equation, and you have one group that's controlling everything. So they're nice examples, but it's almost impossible to replicate it anywhere else. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you that actually the neighborhood I live in is one of the really old residential neighborhoods that was built first privately at EVC, and it's row houses and townhouses and low-rise multifamily and mid-rise multifamily, and it has that nice mix of multiple economic ranges can afford it as well. And I think that, to me, there's a lot that recommends it. I have a 25-minute walking commute to work every day, which is, I think, probably about the best thing about living. The other interesting study that was done recently is in Metro Vancouver. They looked at house prices and they looked at commuting prices, and they actually found even though Vancouver is ludicrously expensive, you're still better to rent in Vancouver than to own out in the suburbs from a total cost perspective. But that's the kind of information that's almost impossible to get people to buy into. Yeah, I mean, it's really challenging in a lot of ways. The systems currently, as they're set up, are completely counter to a lot of the things that we want to do.
You talked about a district energy system, and as you know, we have one here in Prince George, and it's serving some of the buildings in the downtown core.
Yeah.
I think City Hall is one of them. But in the near future, they're going to be tearing down one of the existing hotels and building the new aquatic center there. And I don't know, I'm not at all involved in discussions with that, but one of the ways in which they can significantly reduce their energy footprint or their greenhouse gas footprint is to heat that pool basically off of that district energy system. Basically tying in, laying down some pipe is going to involve laying down some pipe, but because otherwise that pool is going to be heated mostly by natural gas. But if you can, take some of that demand from the energy system, that would be a great use of it. And because there's already a nearby pipeline of the hot water and steam or whatever, it would be a relatively low effort, low cost method, but it still involves a cost, and it's gonna. And I don't know if there's any intention or plans to even look at that right now.
Does anybody know? Anybody with Reeves? Anybody know? I couldn't figure out from the website what percentage is biomass of the district energy system. I know there's clearly some percentage, and in some ways it almost looks like they're saying it's all biomass with a natural gas peaking plant to back up when you don't have enough, but I couldn't really figure that out.
No, I don't have the numbers, but interesting you brought up the pool, because also at city council meeting, there's supposed to be a citizens review with the downtown pool that they're actually going to put a hotel beside it, or in congregation with it. And that was the first I heard when some of the councilors were saying they were surprised that there wasn't a citizen comment on it. And I'm like, I didn't even hear that we were allowed to comment on it. I didn't even know that was a possibility.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to see what happens with that pool if we're going to have another hotel down there, because we're ripping down a hotel and adding a hotel beside the pool. Yeah. But I don't know what percentages of the biomass.
I mean, it's so as I said, if it is on biomass, it's one of less than 6 that I've been able to identify in North America that are running on biomass. And then there's the development in Victoria called Dockside Green, which has been touted as the green development. Their district energy system is still on natural gas, and they can't make it viable for it to run on biomass. So as I say, it would be a real feather in the cap of Prince George if it on biomass.
And for those of you who are not aware, at UNBC there is a district energy system, as it were, that burns biomass, and it's actually 85% of the natural gas that keep the whole campus up. So that's actually a very good success story. So a lot of people are being brought up to kind of as a demonstrator of what we're doing here.
Is that from my neighborhood?
Well, they are collecting. I guess they're being supplied like the residues and stuff like that from the various mills. And I'm not sure exactly what's in it, but definitely the hog fuel and the leftovers are in the piece.
Yeah, and it's not a traditional boiler with high particulate emissions either. It's
Right, it's a gasified boiler.
pretty efficient.
Yeah.
You had a comment?
Yeah, actually kind of takes on that. So earlier you had a pie chart of BC energy demand. Why wasn't biomass part of that pie chart? Or is it part of that?
because, so that data is, I believe it's like 2013, so it will have changed a bit from there, but, you know, coal is 1% and renewables are a sliver somewhere below 1% currently.
They are measuring.
Yeah, they are measuring in circumstances where it's done at a scale that it's measurable. I mean, an individual farm, say, running things on biomass, it would be really difficult for them to get to that. Yeah, anything like the UBC actually also has a district energy system that's running on biomass, partially on biomass. So,
Same supplier.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Have you done any looking at what time frame we're expecting to see some scarcity for energy supply? Because right now it seems like we're just behaving as though it's game on,
Yeah.
and we're at the point now where we're fighting over pipelines to get it out of our country fast enough
Yeah.
to sell it. And it seems to me that there should have been some background calculation, like do we have 10 years, do we have 20 years? Like at
So-
what point is that going to kick in?
My entrance into the energy issue, as I mentioned to you previously, actually came out of forestry, previous to working on energy, was through the peak oil argument, right? So there's the climate change argument about our emissions, and then there was also the peak oil argument about the fact that we're going to reach a point where we have peak oil as much as we can extract, and then we're going to start down the slope. And late 2000s to towards 2010, that was actually a really big issue. The Americans, when they started doing their shale gas extraction, which is causing earthquakes and whatnot, there's no way out of the game. I mean, it's thermodynamics, right? I mean, there's a certain amount of supply and we can get a certain amount of energy out of it. But I think we pushed it down the road enough that people just aren't talking about it again now. And again, the emissions issue is back in the picture. So I don't know. I mean, the numbers I was seeing from some people that were petroleum engineers was saying sort of like they actually thought we might have already reached peak oil in the 2000 teens where we are right now. But I haven't seen anything more recently, and their estimates went from the teens up to like 2050. And so the question now, I guess, is what hits first? Do we get energy scarcity, or do we get issues with climate change where we have to, we have huge disasters and we have to dramatically get off of those sources of energy? I think we're probably still going to pull most of it out of the ground anyways, because if there was a great article a long time ago I saw, and I've never been able to find it again, but it was a day in the life of oil. It was somebody sort of going through their day, and everything they touched that was made from oil, food products and the insulation on wires in their houses, and it was pretty mind-blowing. So when you think about things like plastics and food additives and all of those kinds of things, I still think we're going to pull the petroleum out of the ground, but I think you could argue that there are much better uses for it than burning it.
And you've got countries like Saudi who are already spending billions of dollars on solar energy.
Yeah.
So they're the ones pulling the oil out of the
Right.
ground, but they've already turned the corner.
Right, and there's been a lot of speculation about that, because when OPEC started and they had to start demonstrating what their actual supplies were, all of a sudden all of those oil-producing nations said their supplies were way bigger than they were. And so there is some argument about, do they actually have what they say they have, or are they really starting to see it? And it's true, you look at a lot of the countries in that region, they are starting to make investments.
So what do they know that we don't?
Yes. Yeah. And there's the good stuff. It's easy to get and it's high quality. So, yeah.
Not sure if I know how to frame this question or how to ask it, but if we make the shift to electric cars as opposed to burning fossil fuels in cars, living in a walkable community is great for lifestyle and it has environmental benefits. But if we switch to electric cars where burning fossil fuels isn't the main concern, is it still worth it to develop these walkable communities from an environmental standpoint?
So, I mean, that was one of the things I was trying to raise, was there may be a situation in which places like Prince George can exist as they are. Kelowna is another good example of it, because of electric autonomous vehicles. I mean, I really do think it comes down to choices. There are other reasons. There are things that you can do. For example, we talked a bit about ecology and actually treating wastewater and stormwater. And again, by concentrating the people, you can concentrate, or you can have more of the other uses. But I really think it comes down to people and their choices. And I do think a lot of people, you know, I mean, I'm from a town in Ontario, Barrie, which is not dissimilar than Prince George in size. You know Barrie. So I, you know, and I grew up outside of Barrie, so I grew up in a single-family house in a community where I could go until 10 o'clock at night running around the neighborhood. And, you know, I understand that difference, which is why I think that, you know, we have to look at a host of solutions. So there are other reasons to do it. Whether those reasons are good enough for people to want to do it is a question.
Maybe we've given John enough. Thank you, everybody, for your thoughtful questions and discussion, and let's give John a big hand.